So I know we've done this before, but still, like, can you introduce yourself for the audience who doesn't know you?
Absolutely. I'm Logan Jones. I am in my 5th season with the Arizona Diamondbacks. Prior to my time with the D-backs, I did a couple of collegiate internships, one at the University of Kentucky, one at Wake Forest University, working with a variety of sports. But my last 5 seasons have been spent here in professional baseball with the Arizona Diamondbacks. Thanks again for having me on, Eric.
No, I love it. I love our last conversation, man. So last time we talked a little like overall baseball performance, right? And today I kind of want to like dive deeper a little bit about like asymmetry and PRI. So first of all, like, what is PRI?
Yeah. Like you touched on last time, we talked a little bit on asymmetry, and on purpose. I think we didn't dive too deep into that, and I think today is going to be a good opportunity to maybe explain some of what is asymmetry. How do we view, as an organization, how do we view PRI, and maybe how does that influence our training and kind of our lens that we look through when we're looking at baseball performance. But PRI stands for Postural Restoration Institute. It's basically a company that was developed that kind of keys in on the science of postural adaptation, asymmetry, different patterns that kind of show up in the human body. And there's a great deal of complexity associated with a lot of this stuff. I mean, we're talking anatomy and physiology, we're talking respiratory patterns, we're talking posture and position and how that drives function. And then on top of that, we have like the skill of baseball. And so I think more than anything, the way that we utilize PRI is we use it as basically a lens in which we can view movement, and it's kind of a tool in our tool belt, if you will, the same way that any other methodology or any other principle would be as well. So I don't know. I'd like to keep it relatively simple and explain maybe the basics behind why it is that we're asymmetrical. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is it indifferent? But basically, yeah, PRI, a company that was developed, I think, early 2000s by Ron Haruska, and it studies basically the science of postural adaptation.
So, from a performance standpoint, why do you think there's like more and more performance coaches out there are interested in things like this?
It broke up a little bit there, Eric. I couldn't hear your question.
Oh, so my question is, as a performance coach, why do you think there's more and more like coaches out there, let's say strength and conditioning coaches and like performance coaches out there, are interested in like PRI or asymmetry, these kind of stuff, or even breathing?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think it's really taken hold as of late. I mean, strength and conditioning in general is a relatively new field, right? And then especially in the environment that I work in baseball, it's even newer. Strength and conditioning in baseball really took hold in the 90s, and it's kind of grown ever since. And now we're starting to see strength and conditioning staffs in various organizations that are larger. We have better access to resources and equipment, et cetera. It's starting to become a priority. So I think that with that growth of strength and conditioning within the baseball industry, individuals are becoming more interested in maybe different systems, different methodologies, different ways to improve our training. And I think that PRI is probably just one of those systems. And I think that we really take a hard look at respiratory patterns, how we're pulling in air and blowing air out, and understanding the asymmetry that just comes along with being a human being. Your heart is positioned on the left side and your liver is positioned on the right side, and that creates asymmetry within. That certainly isn't bad. It just is. And because of that, the left diaphragm is smaller, the right diaphragm is larger and has a better domed shape, which in turn affects our respiratory patterning, and the diaphragm is attached to the ribs, and so on. So respiratory patterns can affect bony position. Muscles are attached to bone, which then affect how efficiently or like how fluently muscles are contracting. So, and which then obviously in turn affects performance. So I think that we can layer this thing down as much as we'd like here, but I think that it's becoming increasingly important to have at least a baseline understanding of posture, position, anatomy, and maybe how these things influence our training decisions. And we can be a little smarter in like our exercise selection, our exercise prescription for our athletes to optimize health and performance.
Cool. So you kind of like mentioned like why the body is asymmetry at the first place, right? So, and you also mentioned like it kind of like affect the way we breathe or affect the way we perform. So since our body is asymmetry at the first place, so what would you do to like help it, like maybe try to gain more symmetry, or like yeah
no, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, taking it back to my comment on basically breathing, so we'll call respiratory patterns breathing, drives all human posture and performance, like in all three planes of movement. And because of that, like posture and position are key. So we look at posture from a static standpoint, and then we look at it from a more of a dynamic standpoint as someone is moving through space at a low velocity or at a high velocity. It may look different. But I think taking it back to what are we doing to address some of these asymmetrical patterns, it's number one, like we have to address it as completely, or we have to acknowledge it as completely normal to be asymmetrical. And like, it's my own opinion. And if we're chasing symmetry, good luck. Because the right side of the body is always going to win. That's how the human body was built. Now, within that framework, within that understanding, can we implement corrective exercise? Can we look to target the left abdominals to shift this over to the left side temporarily? Can we encourage continuous effort towards putting us maybe in a bandwidth that we think is acceptable for health and performance? Absolutely. And we do that. We implement different corrective exercise to address different parts of the body to make sure that we're not living in a hot or a red zone from an injury standpoint. So if we see different things pop up where guys maybe lose touch with what it is that we're trying to do, and now all of a sudden we have some low back stuff, we have some hamstring stuff, we have some oblique stuff, and maybe some of that could have been mitigated or reduce the risk of injury through a proper like exercise prescription with an understanding of, hey, like we do have these asymmetries. On top of that, you probably only throw from one side or you hit from one side, which may further drive these, if you want to call them like a faulty pattern. To keep it simplistic, I don't necessarily think it's faulty. I just think it's what we're biased towards. We have this bias of being in a certain position in a certain way, and we have to actively train ourselves to maybe breathe in a different way, in a more efficient way, create a good core program, etc., where now we can start to be a little smarter in our training routines and our training modalities, where we give our players the best chance to be successful and make sure that they're out on the field and available every night.
So as for like breathing, is there like anything you're gonna like how do you coach breathing, or how do you teach an athlete how to breathe? What are some like things you see is like very important for like breathing?
Yeah, it broke up a little bit there at the beginning. I just want to make sure I understand the question. I missed the first part of it. You basically are asking what are some things that are important when we're teaching athletes how to breathe?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a good one. I do think that since that's probably a foundation, like as human beings, we have to pull in air and we have to blow it out. So I think that if we neglect that basic human necessity, I think that we're maybe not pulling at the lowest hanging fruit, if you will. So our core program actually starts with understanding respiratory patterns, understanding that, what it means to be a chest breather or a belly breather, or having adequate diaphragmatic breathing where, the chest and the stomach are rising and falling together in unison. We see most of our guys kind of default towards being a chest breather. They're sucking in air through their neck. The chest is expanding and the diaphragm is not working in an efficient manner. So we'll start with laying guys down on their back on a training table or on the ground where we're taking away, or we're adding points of stability. Basically, we're taking away the demand of having to stabilize themselves. They're just lying on the ground. And we'll give like an external cue. We'll say, hey, put one hand on the chest, one hand on the stomach, and breathe. Okay. If your hand on your chest is rising before the hand on your stomach, we have a chest breather. If your hand on your stomach rises before the hand on your chest, we have a belly breather. Ideally, we want to see those two rise and fall in unison. And now, once we have developed albeit temporary, developed a more efficient way of pulling in air and blowing air out, now all of a sudden we can create stability in this optimal position. So now from this ribs down, optimal diaphragmatic breathing pattern that we've created, now we can do our core pressurization program where we're pulling in air, the obliques are eccentrically contracting. Okay, we're building up pressure within. Now we're creating stability in a good position. Ideally, this leads to them being able to stand up on their feet and move through space in this better position. Now, if guy is not able to actively achieve that, which is very rare on the first instance, now we can implement some corrective exercise. We can get some oblique, some hamstring activity to get some posterior tilt at the pelvis to help us put us in a better non-extended position where now we're able to breathe in a more optimal way. And then from there, we'll just look to layer brick by brick. But I'll say that, like, to be honest, man, it takes a while to create the patterns that we're looking for. And we don't necessarily stay at ground one before we progress on. Like, we can't have guys laying around in the weight room on their back the whole day trying to achieve an optimal breath. It's going to be something that we work on for like kind of our onboarding process, if you will, for a while. So it's an ongoing challenge without a doubt.
So here's an interesting thing. Like, I know breathing is like very important, but how do you teach athlete without boring them?
Yeah, that's probably the biggest challenge, Eric. Honestly, I mean, because look, someone's coming in. We've identified that there's an issue, right? Like, okay, like maybe a guy comes in with an oblique strain. Okay, he's going to be out, whatever, 4 to 6 weeks. Let's just say that's the timeline. So now we have 4 to 6 weeks. Maybe they return to a baseball progression on the latter half of that. So basically, we have call it 2 to 4 weeks where we're in the training room, we're in the weight room, and we're implementing a rehab program. So the guy knows that he's going to be down for a little while. But how are we supposed to lay a guy down and explain to him, hey, it's likely that maybe you're at risk for an oblique strain because of your posture, because of your position. And hey, the way that you breathe influences that posture and position. And by the way, like on top of that, you're asked to rotate at a high velocity here in about 2.5, 3 weeks. So it's a really sticky process. And I'd say that like it's not always smooth either. Some guys relate better to being in the weight room than they do in the training room. Some guys relate better to being in the training room than they do the weight room. So I think number one is we put them in an environment where they're comfortable. We put them in an environment that they want to be in. we do an effective job of communicating, and then we start to implement our processes. But I think keeping things fresh through the implementation of like different exercises, not having a staleness come into play where we're doing the same thing every day, not creating that monotony. So I think that we have a menu of exercises, if you will, that we can pull from to try to keep things new that maybe can all achieve a similar adaptation, or that we know like, hey, if we put a guy in this position or that position, or we ask him to do this versus that, we know that we're going to be targeting an area of need for this individual to address maybe a faulty postural position, something another that is influencing his inability to rotate efficiently. So I think that it's maybe the PRI, this lens that we're viewing this movement from, is the foundational piece to maybe what is our weight room exercise program, which is our like skill progression. So I think it's like basically the ground level. But the truth is a lot of our athletes don't necessarily see the value in that. So I think that that's just a conversation of like, hey, this is why this is important. We don't want to see you in the training room. We don't want to see you on the injured list for an extended period of time. And maybe here are some ways that we can look to like reduce your risk of that.
Yeah, because like nowadays there's like pro split, velocity based training, all kinds of technology posting on Instagram, like they're gonna jump higher, run faster. So I mean, it's hard for us to like talk to the athlete like breathing is like important. It's not like the sexiest thing.
Yeah, no, you're completely right, man. It's a challenge. Like I'd be lying to you if I didn't tell you that it was a challenge. And like sometimes you're not successful, right? Like sometimes we look to do this, we have this goal, and like it's just not. It just doesn't happen as quickly or as efficiently as we'd like. But if we take a guy that we identify as maybe an injury risk, and we pull him closer to a bandwidth that we find optimal, like, hey, like maybe this isn't ideal, but like maybe we pull him from the area where like, hey, this guy, it looks like this guy, it could blow out at any moment, at any point in time. If we pull him to that space and he's healthy and he's contributing to winning baseball games, then I would argue that we've done our job, especially if we haven't cost him from a performance standpoint. So I think that there's a fine line to walk, right? Like we don't want to take away qualities from our athletes that contribute to their on-field performance. So if we're chasing after this like optimal position or patterning, and it takes away from his explosiveness, his dynamic efforts on the field, I would argue that we've done the guy a disservice. So, you know, it's important to keep things simple as we can. Keep a warm-up as simple as possible. Keep a lift as simple as possible. Hammer the foundational concepts. Explain why they're important. And then if it gets to the point where we can progress on and we can get sexy in our training, great. But I'd rather keep a guy on the field and allow him to perform at his best than I would implement some kind of sexy training adaptation, some training methodology. Now we're putting him at risk, or maybe now we're stealing a quality of his that is the reason why he's such a good baseball player.
Yeah, good. So, next thing I want to talk about is like, because we kind of talk about like how the body is asymmetry, but when we are already like asymmetry, and we also have to do like all kinds of like rotation, how does that work?
Yeah. So in keeping it, you know, I mentioned earlier, like there's a lot of layers to this thing. There's a lot of complexity associated with obviously the human body, right? Like in general, like anatomy is a very complex thing. The human body is complex. It's very difficult to like describe in some instances. I think that when we look at if we're talking PRI in particular, or just asymmetry in general, understanding that, like I mentioned earlier, our internal organs are not placed in the same way on the inside, which then are affecting our equilibrium So the importance of like reciprocal movement, reaching, like if one thing is moving forward, something needs to be moving back. If something's moving right, something needs to be moving left, up and down, etc. So in looking at how we are biased as human beings, okay, we're going to be able to get into our right side of our body, our right hip, for example, more efficiently, easier than we're going to be able to get into our left side. Okay, we're going to be able to rotate to the left much easier than we can rotate to the right because of the orientation of our rib cage. We're going to be able to laterally bend to the right better than we can laterally bend to the left, again, because of our rib cage orientation. There's a whole slew of things that we could dive into. I think keeping it simple at the hips and the thorax is probably, I don't know, probably the best place to keep it for our conversation, because then that affects different things. Like, so in our case, what does it mean when a guy has to rotate and he's more efficient from rotating one way than the other? Well, it just takes me back to my original point of, we have to make sure that he's like within an optimal bandwidth here. So we understand that, yes, our right-handed pitcher seems to be able to maybe load his right side a little better than he can load his left. How is that affecting the mechanics, our basic mechanics of throwing a baseball? How is that affecting his repeatability? So like his direction down the mound, is he inconsistent? Is sometimes he unable to get out of his right side once he's almost stuck in his right side? We have guys that really, to be truthful, can't get into either side. They're very inefficient at like loading and unloading both hips or rotating either way. They're basically a sagittal plane monster, if you will. So that basically presents a whole unique set of challenges of, now we need to be able to move more efficiently in the frontal and transverse planes. We probably stray away from training in the sagittal plane with those individuals because they're already beasts. They can already deadlift the house. They can already squat the house. But as soon as you ask them to do a lateral lunge, as soon as you ask them to do something dynamic in the frontal plane, as soon as you ask them to do something with a rotational component, they're terrible. Terrible stability, terrible mobility, terrible strength and power in that plane, because power is very, plane specific, if you will. So I think that it manifests itself to a great degree in baseball because of the rotational component. But I think if we don't first understand what are already our biases, probably as human beings, just with the way that we're constructed, the way that we are made, it's going to be very difficult to understand like why it is that a guy shows up inefficient in a delivery down the mound, or inefficient in his movement, in the batter's box, for example. I think that like having these foundational components, having an understanding of that, will help us understand why it is that we see what we see in a skill component. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So, does that kind of like change the way you train rotation a little bit, or it's kind of like?
Yeah. So it's breaking up a little bit. Can you repeat that? It broke up on me a little bit.
Sorry. So, does that mean like you're gonna change like let's say, so last time we mentioned like you're gonna probably do more of the like forgot the English. Anti-rotation, right? Anti-rotation stuff. So how does the anti-rotational training works?
Yeah, so I didn't hear it all. I just want to make sure. So you're basically saying how does our understanding of posture and position change our approach to training rotation or anti-rotation. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. You're frozen on me. I don't know. My Wi-Fi might not be right, but we'll get through it.
Okay.
Yeah. So I would say that it, more than anything, to be honest, man, it takes me back to the importance of a thorough and proper warm-up routine to address on a daily basis, address general qualities of a warm-up. So increased heart rate, increased body temp, moving all different directions. But then we're talking specifics of a warm-up too. So understanding like what are the demands of our sport? What do we need to do to get an individual ready, like actually ready to go out there and throw or swing at high velocities? What do we need to do to get them ready to sprint at high velocities? And then addressing those different pieces, those different components of our skill-based sport in a warm-up. Okay. So that might mean, hey, we understand that because they're moving at such a high velocity, maybe they don't have an optimal position at the pelvis or at the thorax. Their ribs are maybe, they have flared ribs. They have an anteriorly dumped pelvis. They're in a state of extension. Their hamstrings are in a lengthened position. Their abdominals are in a lengthened position. Okay, so what do we need to do? We need to create some equilibrium. We need to maybe hit some soft tissue on his anterior chain. We'll go soft tissue on quads, on hip flexors. And then we might piece that with some activation posterior chain. So maybe it's some kind of a hamstring glute bridge type deal. We're going to hit a solid, a few different core exercises where maybe we're targeting obliques. We're building that intra-abdominal pressure that we've talked on, and maybe we bring him from a great degree of anterior tilt back to maybe towards neutral. Maybe we can internally rotate the ribs a little bit to take him out of that state of extension. So now his abdominals are in a more optimal position to contract at a high velocity. They're in if we're just talking about basically contractibility of muscles and length tension relationships, we're basically looking to put muscles in an optimal position to contract the way that they are supposed to be able to contract. So if we're in a place of like where we're compromised, we're just basically looking to bring them back to an equilibrium, or basically a state that we've determined is optimal for their health. So I would say more than anything, it like a warm up is probably a great time to address some of these needs-based things. Now, once they're in a better position, now we can train in maybe more of an aggressive state. Or now we can comfortably train rotation or anti-rotation or anti-extension in a way where now it makes a hell of a lot more sense because we know that they're in a good position. If we skip the first part and we just start slinging med balls into the wall, or we start doing these different things in a compromised position, I would say that we're just contributing to their dysfunction. Like we're literally aiding their dysfunction if we're not taking the steps necessary on the front end to put them in a better position.
Cool. Love it. So, when you do like all these warm-ups and like breathing, all these kind of stuff, like usually how much time it takes for the training session?
Yeah, so I'd say on average, Eric, we're probably looking at 10 to 20 minute warm up. So not excessive. We'd like to keep it shorter in nature if we can to increase the the interest, the likewillingness to do that, the compliance to the program, if you will. So we're generally starting with a generalist approach, right? We're going to start them on the bike. We're going to start them with a treadmill walk. We're going to start them with some kind, like maybe some running mechanics, something to basically to increase heart rate, increase body temp, increase blood flow. And then from there, we're going to go maybe address some areas of concern from a soft tissue standpoint. So that's generally self-myofascial stuff, lacrosse ball, foam roll stuff. Maybe if a guy, if that's appropriate for him. We have some of the heavy rollers, like body tempering type stuff. So basically, we're going to address some kind of soft tissue restriction. As I mentioned earlier, that's generally going to look like something quads, hip flexors, TFL, psoas, might be something in the T-spine region, might be traps, might be pecs. Just those are some areas of I guess common areas that we would address. And then we're going to look to back up with some activations. We're going to go posterior chain, hammy, glute. We're going to go adductor stuff, get some serratus, cuff activation. So maybe target some of these underutilized areas where now we're in a much better posture position. And then from there, we're going to move in the different planes at low velocities that we're going to be asked to move in our skill work. So we might move at a low velocity in the frontal plane with some kind of lateral lunge, sway, frontal plane movement. And then we're going to basically wrap it up with a higher velocity. It might be a plyometric. It might be some kind of a med ball or an aqua bag drill. So generally speaking, I would say like ideally we're looking at 10 to 15 minutes. We do have guys that like to take a little longer, but I would say the bare minimum, we're looking at probably 10 minutes and ideally no more than 15 or 20. And that's just in a warm up. So sometimes we might transition from a warm up into a training session. And in season, man, like our training sessions aren't much more than 20 minutes themselves. So we're looking at like a 10 to 15 minute warm up with maybe a 20, 30 minute training session in season. And then we're kicking them out. Hey, go do your skill work, go do your stuff. And then you'll get back in and recover as needed. So we like to use it as a supplementary activity, not necessarily the emphasis in itself.
Cool. Love it. Appreciate it, man.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a baseball performance coach, when you talk about like core session, like core session or like core training, is it going to be different if you're gonna like train like basketball player or like football player?
Yeah, so I think that no matter the sport you play, no matter what the task is at hand, like I mean we're all human beings and we're all going to have some of the same underlying tendencies, right? Like as far as I know, everyone's heart is positioned on the left, everyone's liver is positioned on the right, everyone the diaphragm is uneven in everyone, and because of that, like we're not going to pull in air and blow air out efficiently or symmetrically on the right to left. So I'd say with like that stuff is not going to change. That stuff is like the foundational stuff is going to be the same no matter what it is that we're doing. So I'd say to some degree, like the most foundational components of a core program can remain the same. The concept of breathing and respiratory patterns and the importance of that. And then on top of that, we're stacking a good core program that's just attacking it from a general standpoint is important. And then from there, you can cater your core programs, your core training towards what it is that you have to do. So like, am I going to train like a football player in the same way that I would attack a baseball player? It might be similar at the most foundational level, but then it's going to change as we go. Like football is a contact sport. You have to be able to literally take an impact or brace from an external force, where in baseball, for the most part, we're not running into each other, right? Like there's not a lot of contact going on. So I would say that a lot of our core training is geared around understanding the rotational component of our sport, and the importance of being able to slow that rotation down and brace and decelerate as well. Whereas like maybe that's not a target area in the sport of football. Maybe it is in a quarterback, because they're a quarterback looks somewhat similar from a rotational component to a baseball player to a golfer. But like if I'm training a lineman or a linebacker, maybe there's not that same rotational component at such a high velocity. So maybe we're training him in a different way. Maybe we're putting him under load in different positions where maybe we wouldn't do that in a baseball population or in a softball population. So I think that like the sport itself will, like basically performing a needs analysis will give you some insight into what's important from a training standpoint, not just from a core program, but like in a holistic training program as well.
Cool, I love this because there's like, I think it's like, I've been a coach for like 5 or 6 years, and at the beginning of my career, I went to all kinds of like education event, and they always like talk about like if your body is like asymmetry, that's going to increase the rate of getting injured. And like now there's like tons of like coaches talking about how body is asymmetry at the first place, and we shouldn't be like pursuing like the body should be symmetry. It's fun, man. It's fun. It's really cool to see how these things. Yeah. Go on.
No, I was just gonna say I think that we have to, like, as performance coaches, I think we have to at least acknowledge that there's gonna be asymmetry. Like for us, in my opinion, for us to chase a 50-50 symmetrical approach, I think that's a waste of our time. I think it's misguided. Now, like, do you need to live within I keep using the word like bandwidth. Like if I use it as like we're driving down the highway, we're in a lane, right? Like a lane on the highway. And then if we go a little too far to the right or a little too far to the left, we get this lane departure warning, right? Like, oh, you're you're going into the other lane. Like, we're going off the tracks here. I see this in the same way. Like it's okay that we have some adjustability, some adaptability within the lane that we're in. So that's some of the asymmetry that is acceptable, if you will. Now, once we start to get to a point where like we're symptomatic, we have like some kind of injury history that's problematic, we see trends start to pop up now. Like now it maybe is something that we need to address. But as I mentioned in our first discussion, like if I'm over here slinging 100 med balls from the left side because I just went out there and took 100 swings from the right, like to me, that's a misguided approach just to create like a symmetrical, rotational component from both sides. Like I don't know that that's like the lowest hanging fruit. I think that would be like misguided. So we have to respect like the posture and position and understand, like I'm serious. We have to understand why it is that we show up a certain way. Why, when I look at myself in the mirror, or why when I look at an athlete, do they show up in a way where it looks like they're shifted over to the right? Maybe their right shoulder is a little lower than their left. Maybe their left pec is a little bigger than their right. Maybe their left rib cage is flared out and their right rib cage, it seems to be like internally rotated. Why are these things that way? And then once we understand why, okay, well, this is, I do the research, I do my homework on why it is this is this way. Now I can develop a system, an approach. Maybe I take a little bit from PRI. Maybe I take a little bit from DNS, a little bit from FRC. Maybe I just use my own experiences, and we formulate our own approach, our own system that works best in our environment. If I try to take the PRI system and implement it verbatim in our environment, I'm not going to be successful. I'm going to lose the interest, the buy-in from our athletes. So if I use various different things to a small extent and formulate my own approach that works best here in this environment with our professional baseball players, now I've created a system that works best for this environment and where I feel like I can have the most influence, the highest degree magnitude of influence.
Cool. Love this. Appreciate it, man. it's just cool to like look how these trends been going on. So I know this is our second time, but still, if there's like coaches are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so I'm relatively active on social media, so I think either Instagram or Twitter would be a good approach. My handle is Logan_Jones 95. And then if you'd like to reach me via email, that will work too. That's going to be ljones@dbacks.com. So either of those work, and I'd be more than happy to talk with anyone if anyone has any questions specific to PRI or posture, position, asymmetry, or baseball performance in general. I think that as I mentioned on our first one, we're all pulling the rope in the same direction here. We all want the same thing for our athletes, and I'd be more than happy to help anyone gain an understanding or in development of their own system or their own approach. I think that's been something that I've worked hard to establish myself over the last 5 years working in professional baseball. It certainly doesn't happen overnight, and I think that a lot of time and effort go into developing our craft, and it's never perfect, and it's always changing, always adapting. And as soon as we think we have it figured out, something happens, and it shows us, the environment, the athlete shows us that we don't have it figured out. So I think that's what makes our job unique, is like we have to possess a quality of adaptability and be able to like adjust and adapt on the fly, or we're not going to be successful. So I appreciate you asking me on again this morning, Eric.
I appreciate for the time, man. Really love it. And sorry for my poor English.
No, man, you're good. The Wi-Fi seemed to be kind of in and out. I don't know if sometimes our Wi-Fi here is kind of sketchy. So your English was just fine. I think the Wi-Fi was the culprit, bouncing in and out.
Appreciate it, man.